Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar, Proposed Lead and Copper Rule Revisions. My name is Elena Berg, and I am a planner with the Environment and Development Department of the North Central Texas Council of Governments, or NCTCOG. To give a brief overview of who we are, NCTCOG is a voluntary association of local governments. We are one of 24 councils of government in Texas, and our main function is to transcend jurisdictional boundaries to promote sound development and facilitate cooperation among our member governments. As part of our Water Quality Management Plan program, we host workshops and/or webinars on water quality topics. If you have ideas for future topics for these workshops and webinars, please feel free to send them to me. I'd appreciate hearing them. My email address is shown on the screen. Our main presentation today is from Mr. Erik Helm, Ph.D. and Senior Economist for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, and team lead for the Lead and Copper Rule revisions. He is a 15-year veteran of both Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act regulatory development at the U.S. EPA. Thank you, Erik, for presenting today.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. And I'll be talking a bit about the proposed revisions to the Lead and Copper Rule. Last year, we issued a Federal Register notice providing proposed revisions to the LCR. And today I'd like to talk about or really go over some of the highlights of those revisions, discuss some of the background of the original LCR, provide an overview of the proposed rule and its requirements, and really focus in on 6 key requirements of those proposed revisions. And then I'd like to close with talking about some next steps in the regulatory process, and then I'm available for questions. These revisions are really taking a proactive and holistic approach to improving the current lead and copper rule. So they're looking at testing, they're looking at treatment, they're even making revisions to the public education materials that are supplied to individuals that talk about, the levels of lead and exposure in drinking water and the risks to individuals from consuming that drinking water. Hopefully these proposed revisions will require earlier action to reduce risks of lead and better protect families. These revisions also hope to improve transparency and communication about that risk of exposure to lead and to help protect children. Let's talk about the background. So, as I'm sure you are all aware, lead rarely occurs in source water to drinking water systems. So most of the lead in our drinking water really comes from the lead pipes and the faucets and fixtures that have lead-bearing material. This lead dissolves into the water or through physical vibration or dramatic water pressure changes, particulate lead can be released also into the drinking water. So when lead levels are high, EPA requires that systems treat water using chemicals that keep the lead in place by reducing corrosion. So when corrosion control is not enough in and of itself, there are additional requirements in the treatment technique. Systems must conduct public education to educate consumers about the risks of lead, and they must also begin to replace their lead service lines in the system. The current rule was promulgated in 91. It was revised in 2000 and 2007. It really applies to all of the 68,000 community and non-transient, non-community water systems across the country. So we're serving about 300 million people with this water. EPA has continuously worked with our primacy agencies, both state and tribal, to ensure that the LCR is being properly implemented. For the existing rule, there is a maximum contaminant level goal for both copper and for lead. For lead, the contaminant goal is 0. there is no safe level of lead. For copper, it's been set at 1.3 milligrams per liter. Along with these goals, the rule determines action levels. So for copper, it's 1.3 milligrams per liter. And for lead, it's set at 15 micrograms per liter, or parts per billion. So our 90th percentile from our TAP sampling is weighed against these action levels to determine if corrosion control treatment or later PE and lead service line replacement is required. So for these proposed revisions, we really conducted extensive consultation outside the agency. We talked with our EPA Science Advisory Board. We talked with the National Drinking Water Advisory Council. The Advisory Council set up a subcommittee which gave us specific recommendations for these rule revisions. And we conducted, through our federalism and tribal outreach, a lot of conversation with state, local, and tribal officials. So, taking all this input and our experience implementing the rule, we've developed these revisions that hopefully target actions to reduce lead exposure where it's needed most. So, for the proposed rule really will hopefully identify the most at-risk communities and individuals, and ensure systems have plans in place to rapidly respond when we see elevated levels of lead. So for the, in the most broad overview of the proposed revisions, we're maintaining the health-based MCLG, maximum contaminant level goal, of 0 for lead. And we're also maintaining the action level of 15 parts per billion. In addition to this action level, we're adding a new level. We're going to call that the trigger level. And this level is set at 10 parts per billion. Now really the trigger level is hopefully a new flexible provision. It's designed to compel water systems to take really progressive, tailored actions in planning upgrades to aging infrastructure and to reduce levels of lead in drinking water. And really, there are 6 key areas for our new proposed revisions. So they are basically identifying the most impacted communities and individuals, strengthening our treatment requirements around corrosion control, replacing lead service lines, increasing sampling reliability, improving that risk communication, and hopefully protecting children in schools and child care facilities. So I'm going to mention a few highlights from each of these topic areas. So first, let's talk about identifying the most impacted areas. So the revisions would require systems to develop public lead service line inventories. And once those inventories are developed, they must create a plan for removing those lead service lines. Also, these new requirements will force systems to really pay attention to individual locations within their service area where TAP samples are elevated above the action level. It's going to require systems to attempt to identify the cause of this elevated TAP sample, and if it's within their ability to potentially mitigate the issues, like potentially water quality issues, that might be causing the elevated TAP sample value. And we refer to this in the rule really as our find and fix provisions. So strengthening treatment requirements. So under both this new trigger level concept at 10 parts per billion and the action level at 15 parts per billion, based on sampling results, systems with elevated lead levels will have to reevaluate their existing corrosion control if they have corrosion control in place, or if they don't currently operate some sort of corrosion control, they must conduct a study so that they're prepared to quickly respond if necessary and implement corrosion control in their system. So the idea here is at the trigger level, if a system has CCT in place, or if they jump all the way to the action level, they must reevaluate and re-optimize their corrosion control treatment that they currently have in place. If a system doesn't have corrosion control treatment and they move into the above the trigger level, they would be required to evaluate CCT and determine the optimal CCT that would be used in the system. If they go above the action level, they may, if they're greater than 10,000, if they're serving greater than 10,000 individuals, they would have to implement that CCT at that point. Now, if they are a small system, and in these rule revisions, we're defining a small systems be system serving 10,000 or fewer, or if they are a non-transient, non-community water system, they're going to have flexibility in how they implement corrective actions once they go above the action level. These smaller community systems and non-transients are basically going to, in conjunction with the state, select either to implement corrosion control treatment, conduct a lead service line replacement program that removes all the lead service lines from their system, or implement point of use devices for households within their system. So they're going to have a choice that allows them flexibility in determining what treatment technology best suits their specific needs and their system. So in the area of replacing lead service lines, systems that exceed the trigger level of 10 parts per billion would be required to work with their state and set an annual goal for replacing lead service lines. So if the system then exceeds the action level of 15 parts per billion, they would be required to fully replace a minimum of 3% of the number of known and potential lead service lines in their system annually. Both this goal-based program that's tied to the trigger level and the mandatory program that's tied to the action level would continue as long as the system exceeds those thresholds. And once sampling shows that the system has improved water quality and they're below the trigger or action level for 2 years, these lead service line replacement programs can end. If you remember from the current rule, if they exceed the trigger level and they are required to replace lead service lines, the rate of replacement is 7%. And then you see here from our proposed revisions, the replacement rate is 3%. So there are some reasons for this. Under the current rule, there is this provision that we refer to as a test out provision, which allows systems to basically take samples from the service line, and if they are less than the action level, they can consider that line replaced. This would no longer be allowed under the new program. So systems, we're really requiring systems to replace full service lines with this. Also, partial replacements of lead service lines are allowed, and systems obtain credit towards their 7% under the current rule. In the proposed rule, partial lead service line replacements will no longer count towards their 3% replacement goal. Systems would still be allowed to do emergency replacements, partial replacements, but they don't count towards the goal. And this is because science has indicated that a partial replacement may actually increase people's exposure to lead, at least in the short term. So increasing sampling reliability. So water systems, under the rule, we're going to try to improve sampling procedures and adjust sampling sites to better target locations with higher lead levels, and systems with higher lead levels will sample more frequently. So let's talk about sampling procedures. EPA has had guidance out for a very long time, since the Bush administration, that suggests that systems should not instruct people to do pre-stagnation flushing for their tap samples. They should not suggest that people clean their aerators for particulate lead. and that system should provide samplers with wide mouth bottles. So the first two, both pre-stagnation flushing and aerator cleaning, would tend to lower lead levels in your sample results, and the use of wide mouth bottles, of course, would allow greater flow rate, which is more consistent with how people actually use their water in their homes, and also would therefore better reflect actual exposure within the household. For the second component, targeting the locations with higher lead levels, in systems that have known lead service lines, systems will be required to take 100% of their tap samples from lead service line locations. So under the current rule, they're required to take 50% from lead service line locations. Under the revisions, it would be 100%. Also, we have an improved sampling scheme. If you are above the action level, you have to sample every 6 months is the monitoring period for tap samples. Under the trigger level, it's an annual monitoring period. And then if you're below the trigger level, systems would start with annual monitoring, and if they don't exceed, they can move to triannual monitoring, like most of the systems currently use under the LCR. So let's talk about some of the new aspects of risk communication. Homeowners will learn about the elevated levels of lead in their system sooner. So this is really a codification of the WIN Act requirements. So this is 24-hour notice if the action level is exceeded in the system. And we're expanding this a little bit within the rulemaking for those tap sample sites that exceed the action level. Those specific homeowners would also have to be informed that their water exceeded the action level within 24 hours. In both cases, this 24-hour clock starts once the system becomes aware of the exceedance. So that's they get the information back from their laboratory or their consulting laboratory, and then the 24-hour clock starts. Individuals will hopefully also understand where their lead service lines are in the community and how to protect their family from lead exposure. So there are provisions in the rule that not only do systems conduct a lead service line inventory, but they have to provide the approximate location of those lead service lines to the public, make it publicly available. And we also have certain provisions within the rulemaking that provide for public education specifically to households with lead service lines or those households where the system doesn't know the material of the lead service line, and therefore it could potentially be lead. Then the area number 6, it's protecting children in schools and child cares. So this is the first time systems will be required to test school and child care facilities, and they're going to be providing these results and information about actions that schools and child care facilities can take to reduce lead in drinking water. So the proposed requirements are that approximately 20% of the schools and child cares within the drinking water system will be tested annually, 5 samples per school, 2 samples per child care. The systems must provide the sampling results to the school or facility within 30 days. They must also provide EPA's 3T guidance to those facilities. The 3T guidance, of course, talks about additional sampling that these schools might want to conduct to better understand water quality at the school, lead levels at the school, and it also talks about remediation actions that the school or child care facility can take, and then it gives some information about communicating with their stakeholders, the parents and the children that are at the facility, and the results will be provided to the school or child care, but they will also be provided to the state primacy agency, drinking water primacy agency, and to the local health department. So next steps in the rulemaking process. So the comment period on the proposed rule revisions closed February 12. You can review what comments have been submitted at regulations.gov, and the slide there has the docket number. we received just shy, 13 shy of 80,000 public comments, and in the docket about 700 have already been uploaded so that individuals can look at the material in those comments. And our docket center is trying to work as quickly as they can to supply the rest of those dockets for public review, or rest of those comments for public review. In the coming months, EPA, of course, will be reviewing all these comments and evaluating them to determine if changes need to be made to the proposed rule requirements in response to new data collected as part of the comment period. And we are still looking to promulgate the final revisions to the lead and copper rule in 2020. Now, I rolled through that fairly quickly. I think we have a lot of time for questions then.
Yes, thank you, Erik. Thank you for the great presentation. And now, as Erik said, we will answer any questions, or Erik will answer any questions. Okay, and we have a question already, Erik, and it is, does any part of the revised rule apply to wholesale water districts?
Wholesale water districts that have no customers of their own, I mean, there may be requirements for testing that, or the downstream systems that conduct their testing at their residential locations might wish to negotiate with the wholesale water company to provide changes in corrosion control that the wholesaler is supplying. It might be also the case that those downstream systems have to implement their own corrosion control measures.
Would CCT be required at a wholesale water district surface water treatment plant if test results were at or above the trigger or action levels for lead?
So again, this is dependent on the relationship that the wholesaler has with the downstream systems. I don't think that it would be required directly if that wholesaler is not directly serving households or schools or other facilities.
Has it been considered that if orthophosphates become required, how this will affect wastewater plants with phosphorus limits on their discharge permits?
Right. So if you look at the Federal Register notice for the proposed rule and the economic assessment that was conducted for the proposed rule, you'll see that we did, we do understand that as an impact. We attempted to size that impact, so determine the number of treatment POTW plants, the number of those plants that have phosphorus limits, determine the growth in those potential phosphorus limits across POTWs based on TMDL limits that might be put in place, and we attempted to make an assessment of the cost to those POTWs from increases in orthophosphate use. That being said, we do understand this is a potential issue for the rulemaking.
Okay, thank you. And regarding the sampling at schools, would you please go over the number of samples required again?
Certainly. So at each individual school location within the sampling site, and there would be 5 required samples.
Okay.
At childcares, since they're usually smaller facilities or potentially in homes, only 2 locations are required to be sampled.
Okay. Are all of the proposed revisions applicable when the existing service line material is unknown?
So if you conduct the inventory or the required inventory, and you have a set of service lines or a subset of service lines that are unknown, then the system would have to develop the lead service line replacement plans, and basically they have to act as if they are a lead service line system until a point at which they can effectively determine that they do not have service lines in their system.
Okay. Should communities be holding off on current rule, waiting for the new rules?
No, the current rule is the rule. That is, they are the current requirements that individuals or that systems must meet. There will be an implementation period, so even after our rule is promulgated, the rule revisions are promulgated, there still will be a number of years before those requirements become effective.
Okay. Could you elaborate on the sample collection methodology referred to as the fifth litter?
Oh, fifth leader, sure. So I just discussed the proposed rule, which still relies on the current rule's first draw sampling, tap sampling method. As an option, another option considered under the proposed rulemaking, we have considered shifting from the first draw to sampling the fifth leader from the tap. So everything else remains the same in the sampling procedure, the stagnation period, and so forth. But instead of taking the first leader, the fifth leader would be taken hopefully instead of sampling really the faucet and a section of pipe behind the faucet of a household, you would be sampling water that has sat in the lead service line. So since the service line is usually the largest source of lead, this might result in higher average sampling results for systems.
And the next question is, will any rules be affected for communities having lead and copper levels below the action levels?
So this rule also applies to systems that have lead and copper levels below the new trigger level. There are certain requirements that will still be effective for those systems, like developing the lead service line inventory, developing their plan for replacing those lead service lines. There are still sampling requirements for those systems. Sampling requirement changes from the current rule, like if they are a lead service line system, even if they're below the trigger level, they would have to shift their sampling to all lead service line locations, that sort of thing.
Regarding the testing of schools and daycare facilities requirement, is that only if action levels or trigger levels are reached, or is the 20% required no matter what?
That is required no matter what.
The school sampling requirement would be for 25% of the schools in the system, not all, right?
So how this works is that during the implementation period, a system would have to determine the schools within their distribution system. Then they would have to contact those schools and childcare facilities, but let's say schools right now. It applies the same to childcares. They would have to contact the schools, let them know about the program, try to coordinate with the school to allow them to sample at the locations. They would be required to sample all of those, or attempt to sample all of those schools over 5 years, so about 20% per year. Obviously, the system does not control the schools and child care facilities. So if those facilities choose not to be sampled, then the system can't really force them to sample. So we're working on tightening up the demonstration that systems would have to make to your state primacy agency to show that you tried, but the school, didn't want to be sampled for whatever reason, and so you've still met the requirements of the rule.
How are consecutive systems that purchase treated water to do corrosion control when they have no treatment facilities?
Right. So again, if the consecutive system does not have any direct residences that they supply, it might be that the downstream system and the upstream system may negotiate, but it's really the responsibility of the downstream system. So the downstream system at the entry point to their system might have to be implementing CCT if they are over the action level.
Could you please repeat the percentage of schools and childcare facilities that have to be tested in the water system?
So all of the identified schools and all of the licensed childcare facilities would have to be tested in the program, but not all every year. They must be tested within a 5-year cycle. So it's approximately 20% of those facilities are tested each year.
In regards to testing requirements for known lead service lines, does this apply to services that the PWS labels as unknown?
So I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at there. If a system is identified to have lead service lines, they would develop a sampling pool for their tap sampling that has known lead service lines, and they would sample from that pool. If a system has unknowns, in order to properly sample, they would have to go out and do some extra work to try to really identify the lead service lines to sample from. I guess it may turn out that they can't identify any lead service lines, and so some provision would be made with the state to determine your sampling pool.
Okay, what if a school or childcare facility refuses testing?
Right. As I mentioned, there will be a process to document that, and if they refuse, and you document that refusal, or you document that you contacted the school or childcare facility X numbers of time, that would be acceptable, and provide that material to the state as evidence that you attempted to sampling. You would be still considered in compliance with the rule requirements.
Okay, regarding the lead line survey, are all unknown service lines considered lead until otherwise proven?
So for yes, in terms of certain aspects, like the targeted PE requirements to households with lead service lines, you would have to send that public education warning people about lead, the dangers of lead potentially in their service line, to both known lead service lines and unknown material lines. When or if a system is triggered into by an action level exceedance into replacing 3% of their lead service lines, that 3% is 3% of their lead service lines and the unknown lines in their systems.
Okay. All right, hold on a second while we get the other.
So I've answered a lot of questions very affirmatively, so I just wanted to say, these are all proposed revisions that I'm discussing here, so they are not currently, in place rule requirements. It's still the requirements of the, 91 rule that's as amended in 2000 and 2007. These proposed revisions are not lead requirements right now.
We have some more questions, Eric, so bear with us.
Okay.
If a resident has an LSL but refused to let the PWS enter their property to replace, can we require them to install an RPZ at the meter?
So in general, we are going to allow for resident refusal in this process. It really comes into play near the end of a lead service line replacement program. But if a resident refuses, or the system has contacted the resident a number of times, a sufficient number of times, we haven't determined that yet as part of our final rule. The system would be allowed to document that with the state, and they would still be considered in compliance. It doesn't mean they're totally done, because residents can change, people move, and so every so often the system would be required to go back to those refusals and check again for the ability to replace the lead service line. But there is a mechanism in the rule that allows you to be in compliance and still not replace every service line.
We have a lot of questions about the 3-year sampling at school, so we'll just do one, and I think you'll cover most of them. If the PWS is on a 3-year LC sample, does the school requirement mean that they must be captured each 3-year period to meet the 100% over 5 years?
No, it's a separate timing for the school sampling. So your tap sampling and water quality monitoring periods, whether they be triannual or annual, or 6 months if you're over the action level, it's totally separate from the 5-year monitoring period for the schools and childcares.
And if the school is new and certified as lead-free, will it need to be tested, or can it be granted a waiver?
There is a date of construction in the rule, which I cannot remember off the top of my head. It's, I think, constructed after the Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act went into effect, which is 2014. And if school is constructed after 2014, they do not have to be sampled. Same thing for childcare.
Is the city responsible from the water main to the meter, or the water main to the house in this rule?
So we have not really defined control in the rulemaking. So the definition of control varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, system to system. And so I can't really say where a particular system's jurisdiction ends.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate your time and your presentation and answering all our questions. And
yes, thank you.
Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And this webinar is now over.